always from the heart of the city, and now on demand 24/7 on the CHFI website. This is the soundtrack to a familiar late-night visitor. And I'm Don Jackson, around the world on the internet. In her sepulcher, there by the sea. In her tomb, by the sounding sea. An excerpt from the poem Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. He also wrote, "The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? Of all the places I'd rather not be on a cold night in January, I think a graveyard would top my list." Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. America right before your eyes, and the Beatles on that long and winding road. And I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. I am merely the canvas on which women paint their dreams. The screen star who made that claim died at the age of 31 on August 23, 1926, due to complications arising from surgery for appendicitis and gastric ulcers. Now, there were riots outside the funeral chapel where his body lay and stayed, and even the parlor itself was looted by fans bereaved at the passing of their film idol. As recently as the late 80s, it was said that a mysterious woman was still visiting the tomb of Rudolph Valentino on the anniversary of his death. She, or someone at her behest, brought flowers to his final resting place at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery every year since his death in 1926. She was described as being clad all in black, including a veil, and visibly wept as she laid the flowers at his tomb. Former mistress? He had many, if you believed the stories about him. But I've never heard if the mystery behind her tribute was ever revealed. Valentino, though, wasn't the only celebrity to be remembered in this heartfelt way. For almost 60 years, there's been a visitor to the grave of the poet Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was born January the 19th, 1809, in Boston, Massachusetts. And on October the 7th, 1849, in Baltimore, he died penniless and a drunk. For many years, on the date of his birth at approximately 3 in the morning, a man dressed all in black left a bottle of cognac, 3 red roses, and a note which read, "Edgar, I haven't forgotten you." Now, in the case of Valentino, the tribute was no doubt romantic in nature. The visitor to Poe's grave was an older man. But in recent years, a much younger man has been observed traveling to the grave under the cover of darkness. And I quote, "For reasons known only to themselves, anonymous men have carried out the ritual at the Westminster Hall sepulchre on Poe's birthday each year," said Jeff Jerome, curator of the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum. Unquote. So what's the story behind the tribute? A relative? An admirer of his written work? A debt being paid? Who knows for sure? And maybe it's a mystery that will never be solved. You know, Poe was thought to have died drunk. Recently, one researcher said he may have died of rabies. Whatever he died from, his poetry and prose still attracts readers and lives on. And the fever called living is conquered at last. The words of Edgar Allan Poe. Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and chfi.com. Lights to drive my soul, and Seal's Kiss from a Rose. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and chfi.com. Tom Teed wrote about the Westminster Presbyterian Cemetery in Baltimore, where Edgar Allan Poe is buried, and I quote, "The church itself is spooky enough. It was built in the 1840s from red brick and is bounded by a high wall. Eventually, the wall gives way to an iron fence, the gates of which bang in the wind. Once a fine and prosperous temple, the Westminster is now little more than a collection of relics, and the church boneyard is the most curious relic. It's on a thin strip of land that meanders between the brick and the avenues. One of Westminster's historians says a good number of Baltimore's most honored fathers, including 15 wartime generals, are planted underneath the urban weeds. Like Poe, some of the fathers are believed capable of nighttime pottering. One Civil War commander reportedly sits on his stone and barks about the evils of having killed too many countrymen of the Confederate persuasion. Then there is the dilettante, who surfaces periodically to host wild graveyard parties. And 2, neighborhood narrators speak of the spirit who comes out along Fayette Street to whistle for his dog and sobs on the curb when the animal doesn't come. There is also an 11-year-old ghost, supposedly. She floats and plays games on the top of the cemetery's weathered crypts. The stories of her nocturnal activities were once so widespread that 2 parapsychologists spent a night at the church, in all seriousness, in hopes of getting a glimpse. Unquote. Tom Teed, writing about the Westminster Presbyterian Cemetery in Baltimore. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and chfi.com. David Gray and Babylon, Faith Hill and There You'll Be, and Coldplay and Viva La Vida. And I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and chfi.com. And of course, every year on January the 19th, the anniversary of his birth, a mysterious visitor leaves a bottle of cognac and 3 red roses with a note that reads, "Edgar, I haven't forgotten you." There is no more haunting sound than what's heard when the wind plays with old rusted gates in a country or city churchyard. It unsettles the silence like leaves rustling in the wind. These were the last lines written in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights in 1847. I've always liked them. I lingered round them under that benign sky, watched the moths fluttering among the heath and harebells, listened to the soft wind breathing through the grass, and wondered how anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth. Lovers and other strangers asleep at the gate. Gordon Lightfoot, If You Could Read My Mind, and Sarah McLachlan, and I Will Remember You. And I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers. Again I quote, "Legend has it that Poe's restless spirit still walks the earth, particularly on Halloween. People believe the storyteller rises from his tomb after sundown and shuffles through the vaults, past the overgrown graves, and onto the boulevards where he laments the condition of man. They say his ghost is dirty gray and slow. Fittingly, it carries a bottle. Surely all this is nonsense, but even associates of the Westminster Church admit they don't like to go out in the graveyard after dark, though it is located on the edge of Baltimore's downtown and is surrounded by office buildings and construction. The cemetery is a most forbidding sanctum." Unquote. Writer Tom Teed's words about the place where Edgar Allan Poe is buried. This article appeared in the Toronto Sun in October of 1979. Not much has changed in all those years. Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and CHFI.com. The Beatles with Eleanor Rigby and Phil Collins in the air tonight. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.